So good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin by talking about the storyline for 2023. And that storyline for dairy throughout the US and in Wisconsin was not really the best storyline that we can imagine. So the industry has experienced a great deal of ups and downs over this period of time you're seeing there. And 2023 showed us more of the downs than the ups. So we saw farm margins that reached really record low levels. If you look at the margin of the milk price over the ration value, partly that was due to a drop from the record high prices in milk we saw in 2022. And then we also saw continued higher than average feed costs. And this maybe is a little bit of a washed out version of that, but that's 2023 highlighted there. And what I want to point out is, in my experience as a dairy economist, 2009 was always viewed as the worst possible year for margins. And we actually got down briefly in 2023 at a national level to something that was quite comparable to that. The only thing that was a little bit of a saving grace was that did not endure quite as long as it did in the 2009 downturn that we had. But it was actually still quite painful. Another thing that was not actually really helping us very much is that we had a downturn in dairy product exports on a volume basis. So across products important to Wisconsin, cheese and whey in particular. This actually isn't something that's that unusual. It typically happens, this is a rolling average, so it smooths out a lot of the changes over time, makes it a little bit easier to visualize what's going on there. But the high prices we had in 22 meant that we were experiencing some challenges in export markets that resulted in a decline in that. So that didn't help either. One thing that helped a little bit with the 2023 storyline was that we actually had a pretty strong increase in butter prices towards the end of the year, driven by some really record low stocks to use ratios for butter. Got up to some very high prices over the historical time period, and that actually helped with some of the price recovery that we saw late in the year. So 2023, not a memorable year in the positive sense, but let's now talk about the 2024 storyline. Okay? So we're starting to see the adjustments take place that are going to make for a better 2024 in a lot of different ways. One of the things we look at is what's going on with the numbers of milk cows out there on farms in the top 24 states. You can see through the data we have for November that has been trending down. That's part of that long-term adjustment process. We also are looking at the milk per cow, which actually held pretty steady across the 2 years that we're looking at here. But one of the things that I want to kind of make sure folks are aware of is even if we have the same milk per cow, we're actually making more milk components. Over the last 10 years, we've seen a very significant increase in the amount of butterfat and as well as the other components of milk. And so if you plot it on a component basis here, looking at butterfat, even though we had the same milk per cow, we actually had more butterfat being produced, and a lot of that butterfat was actually being absorbed into the marketplace. And despite that high price spike late in 2023. Okay? So we also have seen some favorable signs for 2024 in terms of the export markets. Our prices are now back in terms of being competitive with some of the other suppliers in the marketplace. These are cheese and butter compared to the EU and New Zealand. You can see that the US has moved into a favorable position that we weren't necessarily in at the start of 2023. It's actually part of the reason that that decline happened, and the rolling average for exports was those higher prices early in 23. Same sort of story is being shown here with non-fat dry milk, skim milk powder, and with dry whey prices. So we're in fairly favorable ranges for now as we headed into the end of 2023. Okay? A number of the previous presenters have talked about the importance of exchange rates for U.S. exports of all ag products, dairy in particular. We actually have a little bit of a mixed story here where relative to some of our major customers for dairy products, China and Mexico, we're moving into more favorable ground on the exchange rates. There's a little bit of an appreciation against the euro for the US dollar, but in general, sort of a favorable position there. So one of the other things that I like to look at is kind of where we are in the dairy price cycle. And if you think about the major shifts that we've seen in dairy prices over the years, a lot of that is being driven by what we think of as cyclical behavior, like long-term swings in the price of farm milk. And this graph, I felt bad about this until I saw some of John's graphs, things with how complicated this was. But this is actually trying to show you basically over the last 3 price cycles, how things have moved down and then they've started to move up in terms of this big cyclical component in the milk price. The dark black line is kind of an average of those last 3, taking out some of the weird stuff that happened during the COVID price cycle. And the dark red line is kind of where we are right now. So what it seems to me looking at this is that we have moved past the worst part of that price cycle and we can start to think about the factors that are going to make for an upswing supported by the data that I showed you, particularly on the number of cows that we have and the milk per cow. Okay? So we also still need to think about not just our own production responses, but we need to think about the global situation. We're starting to see some adjustments on a global level where milk production overall is down in the major suppliers. That's also portending some stronger markets for us. We are seeing a similar pattern in terms of global milk prices and their equivalent. So we reached a peak back there in 2022, hit a bottom point globally. The US tracked along with that to some extent. And now we're starting to see a bit of an upswing in global markets and US markets. So all those are good things for the 2024 storyline. The one place that's maybe a little bit less positive element for the 2024 storyline is what's going to happen with feed prices. Those are projected. These are, you can get a lot of different values. John will probably maybe say something different about this, but these are the futures markets projections of a ration value for dairy from the dairy margin coverage tool going forward through 2024. And what that tool is projecting based on futures markets is we're going to see a little bit of a decrease in the beginning part of the year, a little bit of stability, and then maybe some slight increases later on. But the key storyline is we're going to be above the long-term average for that ration value. So even if we see some strengthening milk prices, that's not necessarily going to make for super good margins in 2024. So with that, I want to fully agree with what Steve said about don't just trust one forecaster, trust a bunch of forecasters to get it in the zone. So I'm showing you here forecasts. The first of the bars there is USDA's all milk price forecast for 2024. And superimposed on that with the blue bar is sort of the expected margin of the milk price over the feed cost. And what USDA is projecting is basically a margin that is like right at the long-term, the 10-year average for the difference between the all milk price and the ration value. I have a number of different statistical models that I use to try and forecast prices that give me some different outcomes there. The next 3 bars sort of show you that same idea of a all milk price during 2024 and a margin. And you can see somewhat like what Steve presented, we're straddling the line across where USDA is with some forecasts that are a little bit above or a little bit below what that looks like. And of course, here in Wisconsin, the all milk price is great for the nation, but we want to think a lot about the class 3 price because about 90% of milk in Federal Order 30 goes into cheese. So the bars off there on the right are showing you what's looking like the class 3 prices projected by USDA and a little bit more pessimistic view that's coming out of the futures markets from CME, okay? So the storyline looks a little bit like this. The margins in 2024 should move closer to those longer term averages. We should see higher milk prices certainly than we saw in the lows of 2023 based on both the price cycle analysis and the overall forecasts. But the feed costs being above the long-term averages will be a little bit of a challenge for the profitability, okay? So other folks have done a little bit of the same kind of thing. I'm going to call these things wild cards that can affect up or down the basic storyline that I'm giving you for 2024. Okay? It's been mentioned a number of times already, the uncertainty in the global economy that affects demand both domestically and globally. Interest rates and inflation will affect a number of different things. The economist going into the end of the year basically was looking at the US economy and saying, nobody knows what's going to happen. I'm glad Steve set the record straight that we know what's going to happen based on the consensus. But of course, this was actually also the same group that said we're totally going to have a recession globally in 2023. Looking at another source of information, the World Bank puts out economic projections for many of the different countries. They're actually projecting something similar to what Steve had suggested in terms of slowed but continued economic growth, both in the US, the developed economies, and then in our major export markets. So there's a little bit of a positive sign there. El Nino was also mentioned by John. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail of that, but we do know that the heat impacts of El Nino, the precipitation impacts of El Nino can have significant effects, not just in the United States, not only on dairy cows, but also on the availability of feed supplies. The Climate Center is actually predicting that we actually might move from a strong El Nino now to something that's a little bit more moderate that might moderate some of those impacts. But again, take that climate forecast for what it's worth. Another thing that is a little bit different than those global things is something that we're doing right here at home. We have a series of hearings that are being listened to by USDA to think about proposed changes to our federal milk marketing orders. For those of you who don't know what a make allowance is, don't worry about it. But what it is part of the equation that's used to figure out how you take a pound of cheese and turn it into a milk price that looks like a class 3. And just based on a rough calculation, the proposals that are currently being listened to by USDA, not decided on yet, actually have the potential to have a fairly significant impact on the class 3 milk price based on changes to those formulas, that thing I called the make allowance. This shows that if you implemented a number of the different proposed changes and you did it for December 2023, you'd actually have a class 3 milk price that's more than $1 less than what it actually turned out to be under our current pricing formulas. That's a significant change. And we have to be a little careful because first, USDA has not decided to do that yet, and we won't hear more about that until the end of the year. There's a consensus that we need to make some of these changes. We also need to keep in mind that if the milk price for class 3 goes down by $1, there's going to be some production decisions that change over time. And so the impacts will have to play out over time. And we should see some offsetting effects that would bring that class 3 price back up. Another policy issue that's being considered at these hearings, and I think it's the other major one that could affect milk prices going forward, is what are called class 1 differentials. If you don't know what a class 1 differential is, don't worry too much about it. But the basic idea is that if milk is used in a beverage, the buyer of that milk has to pay a higher price. That price varies based on the space in which that milk was received. This rather complicated map actually shows an analysis that was part of my testimony at those hearings, suggesting that we actually do need to think about changes in the class 1 differentials, especially increasing them. Based on changes in the spatial value of milk in different parts of the US. The biggest increases actually take place in places like North Carolina and through that Mid-South area. But in Wisconsin, we're actually looking at milk value that's a little bit different than what the current regulatory system says, of up to $1.70 a hundredweight for milk used in beverage use. So that's actually another significant change there. Again, I think there's a consensus that we need to make some of these changes, but there's also issues about what should the base be. Currently, that base is 160. Some people say it should go up. Other people say it ought to go to 0. So we have to watch out for how much of that additional value we can get out of the marketplace for beverage milk, given that that's a declining segment in the industry. And finally, if you like the 2018 Farm Bill, congratulations. You'll have more opportunities to enjoy it through 2024 at least. So the key things are, do we have enough time? A lot of folks are saying, no, we're probably going to look at not getting the Farm Bill done, maybe even in this calendar year. Nutrition programs are a growing issue for the bipartisanship that's typically characterized this process. I think for dairy, the major thing is that we're probably not looking at a lot of major changes in the policy space for that. So one last thing that I want to say before I close is that we often forget about some of the programs that can be very important for dairy producers. And in 2023, the Dairy Margin Coverage Program was really important for dairy producers in Wisconsin. We saw that big drop in prices, didn't completely cushion the blow for sure, but there was significant participation in the Dairy Margin Coverage Program in 2023 by Wisconsin farms. And for the farms that were enrolled, on average, if you look at the total payments that are projected and the total milk covered, that actually was more than $1 a hundredweight. So that was actually a fairly significant cushion for a fair number of farms. So with that, I'm going to put that contact information up there and hand it back over to Pam.